The cruelest thing about humiliation is that the people watching rarely forget it. Helen Brooks sat perfectly still at the end of the polished oak table while her husband laughed loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear him. The sound bounced against the cream-colored walls of the county courthouse in downtown Hartford, Connecticut, drawing nervous smiles from a few strangers seated in the gallery. Richard Brooks adjusted the cuffs of his navy suit like he was standing at a country club instead of a divorce hearing after 43 years of marriage. Then he leaned back in his chair, glanced toward the judge with arrogant amusement, and said the sentence that would later follow him for the rest of his life. "Helen's like a workhorse," he chuckled. "Easy to ride. Too stubborn to know when she's useless." A few uncomfortable coughs spread across the room. Someone near the back lowered their eyes. Even the court reporter paused for half a second before continuing to type. But Helen did not cry. She did not gasp. She did not look at Richard at all. Instead, she slowly folded her weathered hands together in her lap and stared straight ahead at the seal of the state of Connecticut mounted behind the judge's bench. At 67 years old, Helen had learned that humiliation was rarely about words. It was about witnesses. Richard knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted the room to see her as weak before the trial even began. He wanted everyone to believe she was just an aging wife living off his success. The sad part was that most people in that courtroom probably believed him. Richard Brooks had spent decades building the image of a self-made businessman. He donated money to local charities. He shook hands at golf tournaments. He wore expensive watches and smiled for newspaper photographs beside oversized donation checks. People called him charming, generous, intelligent. Meanwhile, Helen became almost invisible beside him over the years. She was the woman who organized holiday dinners, mailed birthday cards, and remembered everyone's medications. The woman who stood quietly in the background while Richard accepted applause. The judge adjusted his glasses and reminded both parties to remain respectful during the proceedings, but Richard only smiled wider. His young attorney, Vanessa Cole, leaned toward him with a whisper and a grin that Helen caught from the corner of her eye. Vanessa looked polished and sharp in her ivory blazer, no older than 35, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to struggle financially a single day in her life. Helen had noticed earlier how Vanessa looked at her, like she was examining furniture left too long in an old house. Outdated. Replaceable. Helen shifted slightly in her chair as a cold draft moved through the courtroom. Outside the tall windows, March rain streaked across the glass in uneven lines, turning the city gray. She could still remember another rainy day more than 4 decades earlier when Richard had picked her up in his father's rusty pickup truck for their first date. Back then, he used to call her his lucky star. Back then, he used to hold her hand with both of his. Funny how certain men rewrote history once they no longer needed the women who helped build it. Richard's attorney began listing marital assets in a smooth, rehearsed voice. The vacation property in Cape Cod, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, the luxury SUV Richard drove. Every item sounded like it belonged to him alone. Helen listened quietly, her face unreadable, though deep inside she could feel old memories rising like ghosts beneath water. Long nights balancing grocery money, selling jewelry to pay utility bills during Richard's early business failures, taking double shifts at a diner while pregnant because the mortgage was overdue. None of that was being mentioned today. To the courtroom, Richard Brooks was the architect of a beautiful empire. Helen was simply the tired woman sitting beside him. But while the lawyers argued over numbers and signatures, Helen slowly reached into her purse and touched the edge of a small yellowed envelope she had found 3 nights earlier inside an old storage box in the garage. Her fingers rested against the brittle paper for only a moment before she withdrew her hand again. For the first time that morning, a faint expression crossed her face. Not sadness, not fear, something far more dangerous. Patience. By the time the lunch recess arrived, the rain outside had turned heavier, coating the courthouse windows in silver streaks that blurred the city beyond them. Helen remained seated while most people filtered into the hallway for coffee or quiet conversation. Richard stood near the courtroom doors laughing with Vanessa Cole, as though the morning had been some kind of business luncheon instead of the public ending of a 43-year marriage. Every now and then he glanced toward Helen with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Helen watched him only once, And even then it was not anger she felt. It was distance. The kind that grows slowly over years, almost too quietly to notice until there is nothing left to repair. A bailiff walked past carrying a stack of folders while Helen carefully opened her purse again beneath the table. Her fingers brushed against the old yellow envelope hidden inside. The paper smelled faintly of dust and cedar from years spent buried in storage boxes. She remembered exactly where she had found it 3 nights ago in the garage while searching for an old winter blanket. Richard had been away at dinner with Vanessa and some investors, leaving the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking kitchen clock. Helen had wandered into the garage because she could not sleep. 43 years of marriage had trained her body to stay awake whenever something felt wrong. The storage box sat behind a broken floor lamp and several paint cans. At first she almost ignored it. Then she noticed her maiden initials written across the side in faded black marker. H.B. Helen Brooks. No one had called her that in decades. Inside the box were old tax returns, utility receipts, Christmas ornaments wrapped in newspaper, and beneath everything else, the envelope. Helen could still remember the strange feeling in her chest when she opened it. Not shock. Recognition. As if some forgotten version of herself had finally reached through time to tap her on the shoulder. Across the courtroom, Richard adjusted his Rolex watch while Vanessa handed him a bottle of imported mineral water. Helen looked at the two of them and suddenly remembered another afternoon long before country clubs and luxury watches entered their lives. Richard had been 28 years old back then, exhausted and sweating through a cheap dress shirt inside a tiny auto parts office in New Haven. The business was failing. Collection notices arrived almost daily. Helen had worked breakfast shifts at a diner from 5 in the morning until noon before driving across town to help Richard organize invoices. Some nights they survived on canned soup and saltine crackers because they could not afford groceries. Richard used to sit at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, whispering that he was terrified of losing everything. Helen never told him she was terrified too. Instead, she sold her late mother's jewelry piece by piece. First the bracelet, then the pearl earrings. Finally the diamond ring her mother had left her before passing away. Richard cried when he learned what she had done. He held Helen in their cramped kitchen and promised her none of the sacrifice would ever be forgotten. One day, he told her, everything we build will belong to both of us. Helen closed her eyes briefly at the memory. Funny how promises could disappear once money arrived. A sharp laugh from the hallway pulled her attention back to the present. Vanessa entered the courtroom first, heels clicking across the marble floor with polished confidence. Richard followed behind her, carrying himself like a man admired everywhere he went. But Helen noticed something different this time. The moment Richard smiled at Vanessa, she smiled back only halfway before immediately checking her phone. Small detail. Most people would miss it. Helen did not. Over the years she had become an expert at studying people while remaining unnoticed herself. She saw impatience hidden behind polished manners. She saw calculation hiding beneath charm. And for the first time in months, she realized Richard was not nearly as in control as he pretended to be. The judge returned a few minutes later and everyone rose. Helen stood carefully, smoothing the sleeves of her pale blue sweater. Richard looked toward her with the same smug expression he had worn all morning. He still believed she would sit quietly while strangers dismantled her life piece by piece. What he did not know was that the envelope resting inside her purse contained a copy of the original business loan agreement from 1983. And beside Richard's signature was another name written in blue ink. Helen Brooks. The second afternoon of the trial carried a different kind of tension through the courthouse. It was quieter now, heavier somehow, as if the room itself sensed something shifting beneath the polished legal arguments and rehearsed smiles. Helen sat in the same seat beside her attorney, wearing the same pale blue sweater and pearl earrings she had worn for nearly every important moment of her adult life. To most people she looked calm, ordinary, forgettable even. But inside her purse rested the yellowed envelope like a heartbeat she could suddenly hear again after years of silence. Richard entered the courtroom 15 minutes late with Vanessa at his side, both of them carrying paper coffee cups from the cafe across the street. He looked relaxed, almost entertained, greeting people with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to admiration. Helen watched him shake hands with another attorney near the entrance and remembered all the time she had ironed his shirts before charity dinners, All the morning she woke before sunrise to prepare breakfast before his business meetings. All the years she quietly shaped herself around his ambitions until she nearly disappeared inside them. It amazed her now how easily the world rewarded men for sacrifices women made in private. The judge called the session to order, and Vanessa immediately stood to continue presenting Richard's financial statements. Her voice was polished and smooth, carrying the kind of expensive confidence that came from elite schools and polished office buildings overlooking city skylines. She spoke about investment growth, retirement planning, and property ownership while occasionally glancing toward Helen with faint impatience. At one point she referred to Richard as the primary financial architect of the marriage. And several people nodded slightly as if the phrase sounded logical. Helen lowered her eyes briefly. Primary architect. Such clean words for such a dirty kind of erasure. Vanessa moved to a large display board showing the timeline of Richard's company expansion over the years. New locations. Revenue increases. Awards. Magazine features. Richard smiled modestly during the presentation, though Helen knew that expression well. It was the smile he wore whenever he wanted praise without appearing desperate for it. Then Vanessa made a mistake. Small. Almost invisible. But Helen noticed immediately. Mrs. Brooks did not hold any formal operational role in the company during its early years, Vanessa stated confidently. Her involvement was minimal and largely domestic in nature. Helen felt something cold settle into place inside her chest. Minimal. Domestic. 43 years reduced to two convenient words. Her attorney, Daniel Mercer, quietly turned toward her. He was in his late 60s with silver hair and careful eyes, the kind of lawyer who spoke less than most people expected. Helen had hired him only a week earlier after another attorney dismissed her case as unwinnable. Daniel had listened to her story for nearly 2 hours without interrupting once. Then he asked a single question. "Mrs. Brooks," he had said gently, "what are they assuming you no longer have?" At the time, Helen did not understand what he meant. Now she did. Daniel slowly stood from his chair. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "before opposing counsel proceeds further, I would like to submit additional documentation related to the company's formation in 1983. Richard barely reacted at first. He simply adjusted his tie while Vanessa accepted the folder from the court clerk. But the moment she opened it, the color in her face shifted almost imperceptibly. Richard noticed immediately. "What is it?" he whispered under his breath. Vanessa did not answer right away. She flipped through the documents once more, slower this time. Helen could see the exact second Richard realized something was wrong. The confidence around his mouth tightened. His shoulders stiffened. Daniel remained perfectly composed. "Included in the submission," he continued, "is the original business loan agreement used to secure the first operating funds for Brooks Automotive Supply Incorporated." The courtroom fell unusually quiet. Even the judge leaned slightly forward. Vanessa quickly recovered enough to object, arguing relevance and timing, but her voice no longer carried the same effortless control. Daniel simply nodded toward the paperwork. "The agreement clearly identifies Mrs. Helen Brooks as co-signer and financial guarantor for the original loan." Richard finally looked directly at Helen then, truly looked at her for the first time in months. His expression was not anger yet. It was disbelief. As though he could not understand how the quiet woman he had underestimated was suddenly disrupting the story he spent decades constructing. Helen met his stare without speaking. And for the first time since the divorce proceedings began, Richard Brooks looked uncertain. Richard did not speak to Helen after the hearing ended that afternoon. He walked out of the courtroom beside Vanessa with quick, tense steps, his jaw tight enough to show beneath the expensive shave cream and polished appearance he normally maintained so carefully. Reporters near the courthouse entrance called his name, but for the first time since the divorce proceedings began, Richard ignored them completely. Helen remained behind with Daniel Mercer while the courtroom slowly emptied around them. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly as court clerks stacked paperwork and gathered legal folders from the long wooden tables. Daniel adjusted his glasses while reviewing the loan documents once more. "There is more here than he expected," he said quietly. Helen nodded but said nothing. Her emotions no longer moved in sharp waves the way they had during the first weeks after Richard filed for divorce. Back then she had cried quietly in the laundry room so the neighbors would not hear her through the open kitchen windows. She had blamed herself for the distance in the marriage. She wondered if aging had simply made her easier to discard. But now, sitting inside the nearly empty courtroom, she felt something entirely different beginning to settle into place. Clarity. Daniel carefully slid the papers back into the folder. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, lowering his voice, "these records prove you were financially tied to the company from the beginning. But I believe there is another reason Richard never expected these documents to appear." Helen looked toward him. "What reason?" Daniel hesitated briefly before answering. "Because men like your husband often assume women stop keeping records once they stop being appreciated." The words lingered in Helen's mind long after she left the courthouse. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the sidewalks wet beneath the pale gray evening sky. Hartford moved around her in the usual rush of traffic lights and impatient pedestrians, but Helen walked slowly toward the parking garage with her coat folded over one arm. She passed a jewelry store window and caught sight of her reflection for a moment. Silver hair carefully pinned back. Fine wrinkles around tired eyes. A woman most people overlooked in less than 3 seconds. Richard used to say she blended into rooms too easily. What he never understood was that invisible people noticed everything. Helen reached her car and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Her hands rested quietly atop the steering wheel as memories returned one by one, no longer blurred by grief. She remembered the exact day Richard first met Vanessa Cole. It had been at a charity fundraiser 18 months earlier at the Hartford Country Club. Helen had worn a dark green dress and spent most of the evening greeting donors while Richard moved confidently through the ballroom shaking hands. Vanessa was there representing a law firm that sponsored the event. Young, elegant, sharp-eyed. Helen remembered noticing how Richard straightened his posture whenever Vanessa laughed at his jokes. First Helen ignored it. Men enjoyed attention. That was hardly new. But then came the late business dinners. The sudden gym membership at 71 years old. The expensive cologne replacing the old aftershave he had used for decades. Small things. Predictable things. Helen had confronted him only once. It happened in their kitchen late one night after he returned home nearly 2 hours past midnight smelling faintly of wine and cedar perfume. Richard barely looked at her while loosening his tie. "You are imagining problems because you are bored," he told her coldly. Helen remembered standing there beside the refrigerator light in complete silence while something inside her quietly cracked. Not because another woman existed, but because Richard spoke to her as though decades of loyalty had become an inconvenience. 6 months later he officially filed for divorce. Irreconcilable differences. That was the phrase written across the paperwork delivered to her front door by a courier on a Tuesday afternoon. 43 years summarized in 2 words. Helen finally started the engine and drove home through wet Connecticut streets lined with bare March trees. The house sat exactly as she left it that morning, large and immaculate and strangely hollow now that Richard rarely stayed there. She stepped inside, removed her coat, and noticed a small package resting near the front entry table. No return address. Only her name written neatly across the front. Helen carried it carefully into the kitchen beneath the warm yellow light above the stove. Inside the package was a flash drive and a folded handwritten note. The handwriting belonged to someone she recognized immediately. Margaret Ellis, Richard's former executive assistant who retired 3 years earlier. Helen unfolded the note slowly. It contained only one sentence. "I kept copies because I knew one day you would need the truth." Helen stared at the flash drive resting in her palm while the kitchen clock ticked softly behind her. Then for the first time in many months she smiled. Helen did not open the flash drive immediately. She carried it upstairs instead, placing it carefully beside the lamp on her nightstand while the house settled into its usual nighttime silence around her. For years she had hated silence because it reminded her how alone she often felt even during the marriage. Richard filled rooms with noise, phone calls, business conversations, television programs, golf stories, and endless opinions about people he barely knew. But now the quiet felt different. Cleaner somehow. Honest. Helen changed into a soft gray cardigan and stood for a moment beside the bedroom window overlooking the backyard. Rainwater still clung to the bare branches behind the house, reflecting pale moonlight across the dark lawn. She remembered planting those trees herself when their youngest son left for college nearly 20 years earlier. Richard had complained they were unnecessary, too expensive, too much maintenance. Yet years later he proudly told dinner guests the landscaping made the property look elegant. That had always been the pattern. Helen built the roots. Richard accepted the compliments. Downstairs the grandfather clock struck 9. Helen finally returned to the bed and picked up the flash drive again. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear but from anticipation. Margaret Ellis had worked beside Richard for almost 25 years. She knew every contract, every business account, every quiet conversation held behind office doors after employees went home for the evening. Margaret was also one of the few people who had always treated Helen with genuine respect. Every Christmas she sent handwritten cards instead of printed ones. Every birthday she remembered Helen's favorite flowers were white lilies, not roses. 3 years earlier Richard threw Margaret a retirement party at an upscale steakhouse downtown. He praised her loyalty in front of executives and investors while barely glancing at the woman who had helped protect his company for decades. Helen remembered Margaret's expression that night very clearly. Polite, grateful, but tired. As though she had spent years swallowing things she wished she could say aloud. Helen inserted the flash drive into her laptop and waited while several folders appeared on the screen. Emails, financial statements, internal memos, calendar records. Her eyes moved carefully across file names until one folder stopped her completely. Personal transfers. Helen clicked it open slowly. Inside were scanned documents showing money moved through multiple accounts over the past 18 months. Large amounts. Some transferred into investments connected to Richard alone. Others redirected into trusts Helen had never heard about before. Then she saw Vanessa Cole's name attached to one of the transaction records. Helen leaned back slightly in her chair. The room suddenly felt colder. She opened another file. This one contained copies of internal emails between Richard and a financial advisor discussing asset protection strategies before formal separation proceedings. The earliest email was dated almost 2 years earlier. 2 years. Richard had already been planning the divorce while still sitting across from her at anniversary dinners pretending everything was normal. Helen stared at the screen for a long moment without blinking. What hurt her most was not the money. It was the performance. The way Richard kissed her cheek at charity events while secretly preparing to erase her from the life they built together. The way he still asked her to host Christmas dinner while moving assets behind closed doors. The humiliation no longer came from being left. It came from realizing she had been treated like an obstacle instead of a human being. Helen continued scrolling through the files until another document caught her attention. This one was an apartment lease agreement in downtown Hartford signed by Richard nearly 11 months earlier. The address was familiar. Helen remembered driving past the luxury building several times on errands. Floor-to-ceiling windows, private concierge, valet parking, a place designed for people beginning glamorous new chapters in life. She almost laughed when she realized the lease began 1 week before Richard took her to Martha's Vineyard for their anniversary trip. He had toasted 43 years of marriage beside the ocean while secretly furnishing another life for himself 50 miles away. Helen closed the laptop slowly and sat in silence. Somewhere downstairs the refrigerator motor hummed softly through the empty house. She thought she might cry again. Instead she felt something steadier growing inside her. Not revenge exactly. Something deeper. Recognition. Richard had spent years believing kindness made Helen weak because he mistook gentleness for dependency. But he forgot something dangerous about women who survive disappointment quietly. They learn how to observe before they act. Helen rose from the chair and walked back toward the bedroom window. Across the street a porch light flickered on as one of the neighbors returned home late from work. Ordinary life continued everywhere around her while her own marriage collapsed piece by piece. Yet standing there in the darkness, Helen realized she no longer wanted Richard back. She wanted the truth exposed so completely that he would be forced to look at himself without the protection of applause, money, or carefully polished charm. Behind her, the laptop screen remained glowing softly on the nightstand. And inside one final folder was a recording Margaret Ellis had labeled with 4 simple words. For the court to hear. Helen barely slept that night. The recording on the flash drive remained unopened beside her laptop until nearly 2 in the morning while rain tapped softly against the bedroom windows. She sat wrapped in a cream-colored blanket at the edge of the bed staring at the file name glowing on the screen. For the court to hear. For simple words carrying the weight of something irreversible. Helen understood enough about people to know that once certain truths entered public air, relationships never returned to what they were before. Even lies left scars after exposure. Finally, with slow, steady fingers, she clicked the file. At first there was only muffled background noise and the sound of papers shifting across a desk. Then Richard's voice filled the room. Calm. Confident. Familiar in a way that suddenly made Helen feel tired all over again. By the time she realizes what is happening, he said with a short laugh, the accounts will already be protected. Another voice answered quietly, likely the financial advisor from the email records. And Mrs. Brooks does not suspect anything? Richard laughed again, sharper this time. Helen still thinks loyalty matters. That is the advantage. Helen closed her eyes immediately. Not because the words shocked her. Deep down she already knew the marriage had become dishonest long before the divorce papers arrived. What wounded her was the casualness in his tone, the complete absence of guilt. Richard spoke about her the way businessmen discussed outdated equipment they planned to replace. The recording continued. There were conversations about property transfers, tax shelters, and investment restructuring. Then came the part that made Helen sit perfectly motionless. Honestly, Richard said, she was useful when we were younger. She worked hard, took care of everything at home. But people like Helen confuse sacrifice with value. Silence followed for several seconds before the advisor responded carefully. 43 years is a long marriage. Richard gave a dismissive sigh. Exactly. I paid my dues. Helen stopped the recording there. The room felt unbearably quiet afterward. Somewhere downstairs the old heating system clicked softly through the walls of the house they once fought so hard to keep during difficult years. Helen remembered standing beside Richard in this very bedroom decades earlier while snow leaked through damaged window frames because they could not afford repairs yet. She remembered sleeping in winter coats during one terrible January, when the furnace broke and every dollar went toward keeping the business alive. Back then Richard used to hold her hand in the dark and promise they were building a future together. Helen wondered now if he truly believed those promises at the time, or if ambition eventually hollowed him out slowly from the inside. The next morning the sky above Hartford cleared for the first time all week. Pale sunlight stretched across the kitchen counters while Helen brewed coffee and reviewed the documents again with careful attention. She no longer felt emotional while reading them. The grief had transformed overnight into something sharper and more disciplined. By 10 o'clock she sat inside Daniel Mercer's office overlooking Main Street while traffic moved steadily below the tall windows. Daniel listened to the recording without interrupting once. When it ended, he removed his glasses slowly and leaned back in silence. Well, he said finally, that changes everything. Helen studied his expression carefully. Can it be used in court? Daniel nodded once. If the chain of custody is verified and Margaret Ellis is willing to testify regarding the records, absolutely. Helen lowered her eyes briefly toward the polished wooden desk between them. I never wanted to destroy him, she admitted quietly. Daniel remained silent for a moment before answering. Mrs. Brooks, there is a difference between revenge and refusing to disappear. The words settled deeply inside her. Refusing to disappear. For years Helen had made herself smaller to preserve peace inside the marriage. Smaller opinions. Smaller needs. Smaller dreams. She spent decades protecting Richard's reputation while quietly abandoning parts of herself little by little until even her children sometimes introduced her simply as Dad's wife at social events. But now, sitting inside the law office with sunlight warming the edge of the desk, Helen realized something important. Richard never feared losing her emotionally. He feared losing control of the story. Daniel reached for the folder of evidence and organized the papers carefully into separate stacks. There is one more thing, he said. Margaret included additional financial records showing transfers connected to the apartment lease and several luxury purchases. Helen looked toward him. For Vanessa? Daniel nodded subtly. Including jewelry. Helen almost smiled despite herself. Not because another woman was involved. That part no longer surprised her. but because Richard had become painfully predictable. Older men with fragile egos often mistook attention for love and admiration for loyalty. Helen stood and walked slowly toward the office window overlooking downtown Hartford. People hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases beneath the bright March sky. Ordinary strangers moving through ordinary mornings while her own life prepared to split wide open in front of a courtroom. Behind her, Daniel gathered the files into a thick leather binder. "The next hearing is Friday," he said calmly. "And I believe your husband is about to learn that quiet women are often the most prepared." Friday morning arrived with bright sunlight pouring across downtown Hartford, but inside the courthouse the atmosphere felt colder than ever. People filled the gallery seats earlier than usual after word spread that new financial evidence would be presented during the Brooks divorce proceedings. Helen noticed the shift immediately the moment she stepped through the courtroom doors beside Daniel Mercer. Conversations softened. Eyes followed her longer now. Not with pity anymore but curiosity. Richard was already seated at the opposite table wearing a charcoal gray suit and a carefully controlled expression that looked almost convincing from a distance. Almost. But Helen saw the strain beneath it immediately. The stiffness in his jaw. The way his fingers tapped once against the tabletop before stopping abruptly when he noticed her watching. Vanessa Cole sat beside him reviewing paperwork with unusual intensity. Gone was the relaxed confidence she carried earlier in the week. She no longer smiled at Richard between conversations. She barely looked at him at all. Helen took her seat quietly and folded her hands together while sunlight stretched across the polished courtroom floor. For years she had entered rooms trying not to make people uncomfortable. Today she simply existed without apology. The hearing began promptly at 9 o'clock. Vanessa stood first, attempting to regain control of the narrative by arguing that Helen's recent evidence lacked context and exaggerated normal financial restructuring during divorce preparation. Her voice remained polished, but tiny cracks had begun appearing beneath the surface. She spoke faster than before, repeated herself twice, mispronounced one date before correcting it quickly. Richard kept his eyes fixed forward the entire time, though Helen noticed he had stopped making smug little comments under his breath like he did during earlier hearings. Daniel Mercer rose calmly once Vanessa finished. "Your Honor," he began evenly, "the petitioner has consistently portrayed Mrs. Helen Brooks as a passive dependent spouse with minimal involvement in the construction and protection of marital assets. We believe the evidence now demonstrates something very different." The courtroom grew still. Daniel submitted copies of the financial transfers, apartment lease agreements, and internal emails recovered from Margaret Ellis's records. Vanessa immediately objected several times, but each objection sounded weaker than the last. Then Daniel requested permission to play the audio recording. Richard finally looked alarmed. Real alarm this time. Not irritation. Fear. "Your Honor," Vanessa interrupted sharply, "we have concerns regarding authenticity and admissibility." "The recording has already been verified," Daniel replied calmly, "and Mrs. Margaret Ellis is prepared to testify regarding its origin if necessary." Helen watched Richard's expression carefully as the judge approved the request. For the first time in decades, Richard Brooks looked like a man losing control of a room. The recording began softly through the courtroom speakers. Papers rustling, chairs moving. Then Richard's voice filled the silence with brutal clarity. "By the time she realizes what is happening, the accounts will already be protected." Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa lowered her eyes toward the table. The recording continued. "Helen still thinks loyalty matters. That is the advantage." The silence inside the courtroom changed completely after that sentence. It was no longer ordinary quiet. It was the kind that follows shattered illusions. Richard's face darkened slowly, while the audio played through every calculated conversation about hidden transfers and strategic asset protection. Helen remained perfectly still beside Daniel. She did not glance around the room to see reactions. She did not smile. She did not look triumphant. That was what made the moment powerful. Richard finally slammed his hand against the table hard enough to startle several people nearby. "This is ridiculous," he snapped suddenly. "She is twisting everything." The judge immediately warned him to control himself, but Richard barely listened. Years of carefully maintained charm were beginning to crack apart under pressure. I built that company, he said loudly, looking around the courtroom as if searching for support. I worked for everything I have. Daniel answered quietly. No one disputes your work ethic, Mr. Brooks. The issue is whether you intentionally attempted to conceal marital assets while publicly humiliating the woman who helped build them beside you. Richard turned toward Helen then, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. You went through my private records, he demanded. Helen met his stare calmly. No, Richard, she said softly. I finally looked at them. The sentence landed harder than shouting ever could have. Even Vanessa slowly leaned back in her chair, as though realizing she no longer wanted to stand too close to the collapse happening beside her. The judge called for a brief recess moments later. People immediately began whispering throughout the courtroom, while attorneys gathered documents and reporters hurried toward the hallway outside. Richard remained seated at the table staring down at the evidence spread before him. Helen rose quietly and adjusted the sleeve of her sweater. As she turned to leave for the recess, she heard Richard speak her name for the first time in weeks without arrogance attached to it. Helen. She paused but did not face him immediately. His voice sounded smaller now. Unsteady. Why are you doing this? Slowly, Helen turned toward the man she once loved enough to sacrifice pieces of herself for. Then she answered with complete calm. Because you spent years treating my silence like permission. The courtroom remained in recess, but the energy inside the courthouse did not relax. It intensified. Conversations echoed through the hallways, mixing with the distant sound of footsteps and elevator chimes as attorneys, clerks, and observers processed what they had just heard. Helen stood near a tall column just outside the courtroom doors while Daniel Mercer spoke quietly with a court clerk about procedural details for the next session. Helen did not join the surrounding conversations. She simply observed. Richard stood 20 feet away near a set of glass doors leading to the corridor, surrounded briefly by Vanessa and two members of his legal team. But the dynamic had changed. He was no longer the center of attention. Vanessa kept her voice low, her posture tight, and her usual polished composure appeared strained. At one point she stepped slightly away from Richard mid-conversation, as if needing physical distance to think clearly. That small movement did not escape Helen's attention. Richard noticed it too. His expression hardened as he followed Vanessa with his eyes, but she did not return his gaze immediately. Instead, she checked her phone, typed something quickly, and then excused herself without waiting for his response. Richard was left standing alone near the glass doors for a brief moment before one of his attorneys approached him again with a stack of papers. Helen watched all of it without reaction. The collapse of image rarely arrived all at once. It came in small separations like that. Subtle withdrawals. Shifting alliances. People quietly stepping away from the story they once supported. Daniel returned to Helen's side after a few minutes. The judge is reviewing additional motions, he said softly. We may resume sooner than expected. Helen nodded. Her thoughts were elsewhere. She was thinking about something Daniel had said earlier in the week. Refusing to disappear. Those words had followed her like a quiet echo since she first heard them. Not revenge. Not anger. Just refusal. A few reporters had gathered near the hallway entrance now, speaking in hushed tones as they checked notes and prepared questions. One of them glanced at Helen and quickly looked away again, as if unsure whether she was still the same invisible figure they had assumed she was at the beginning of the case. Richard suddenly stepped away from his attorneys and walked directly toward Helen. It was the first time that day he approached her without being prompted by legal necessity or courtroom structure. His pace was slower than before, less controlled. When he stopped in front of her, he did not immediately speak. For a brief moment he simply looked at her. Really looked. Not as a wife. Not as a legal opponent. But as something unfamiliar. You planned this, he said finally, his voice low but tense. Helen did not respond immediately. She studied his face the way one might study a distant photograph that no longer carries emotional clarity. No, she answered calmly. I prepared for it. Richard gave a short, bitter laugh. Prepared, he repeated. You think this is justice? Helen considered the question carefully. I think it is truth, she said. Behind him, one of his attorneys approached quickly, placing a hand lightly on his arm as if trying to guide him away. But Richard did not move. For the first time since the proceedings began, he looked uncertain about where he belonged in the space around him. "You are destroying everything," he said more quietly now. Helen's expression did not change. "Everything you built on secrecy was already unstable," she replied. The attorney finally managed to guide Richard a few steps away, but he continued to look back at Helen as if trying to find the version of her he remembered. The version that accepted explanations. The version that stayed quiet. When he was far enough away, Daniel exhaled slowly beside her. "He is beginning to realize the structure is no longer protecting him," he said. Helen turned slightly toward him. "Structures always look strong," she said, "until someone checks what they are built on." The recess ended sooner than expected. Court officers began calling participants back into the courtroom. The hallway filled again with movement and controlled urgency. Helen adjusted her posture and walked forward with Daniel beside her. As she entered the courtroom again, she noticed something different in the atmosphere. The confidence that Richard once carried into every hearing was no longer present in the same way. It had fractured into smaller, uncertain pieces. Vanessa sat already at the defense table when Helen entered, but she no longer spoke to Richard. She reviewed documents alone, her pen moving quickly across notes while avoiding eye contact entirely. Richard followed moments later and stopped briefly when he saw Helen already seated. This time he did not smile. He did not perform. He simply sat down heavily in his chair, as if the weight of the situation had finally begun to settle in. The judge entered shortly after and called the courtroom to order. Silence returned immediately, but it was no longer the same silence from earlier hearings. It carried awareness now, attention, expectation. Daniel stood again, ready to proceed, while Helen remained still. For the first time since the divorce began, she was no longer the person being defined in the room. She was the one holding the definition. The courtroom fell into a silence so complete that even the soft shuffle of paper seemed unusually loud when the session resumed. Helen sat upright with her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm in a way that no longer required effort. Something had shifted inside her during the recess, something irreversible and steady. It was no longer about proving anything to Richard or anyone sitting in that room. It was about allowing truth to exist without interruption. Richard sat across from her, but he no longer carried the same presence he had at the beginning of the trial. His shoulders were slightly lowered, and his eyes moved less confidently across the room. Vanessa remained beside him, but the distance between them had grown subtle yet undeniable. She was present physically, but emotionally disengaged, focused more on documents than on him. The judge reviewed the next set of submissions and gave Daniel Mercer permission to proceed. Daniel stood slowly, adjusting his notes with deliberate precision. When he spoke, his voice carried a controlled calm that immediately focused the room's attention. "Your Honor, at this point we have established a consistent pattern of concealed financial activities spanning multiple years, including premeditated asset transfers and misrepresentation of marital contributions." He paused briefly, allowing the words to settle before continuing. "We are now prepared to present testimony from a former executive assistant who directly participated in maintaining financial records for Brooks Automotive Supply Incorporated during the relevant period." Helen's gaze did not move, but she felt a subtle change in the atmosphere as Daniel finished speaking. The door at the side of the courtroom opened quietly, and Margaret Ellis entered. She walked with slow, careful steps, carrying herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent too many years observing without being allowed to speak. Richard's reaction was immediate, but restrained. His jaw tightened slightly, and his fingers curled once against the edge of the table before he forced them to relax. Vanessa finally looked up from her documents, her expression shifting from focus to concern. Margaret took the oath and stood at the witness stand. For a few seconds she simply looked straight ahead, as if gathering the courage to step fully into a moment she had avoided for years. Then she began to speak. Her voice was steady but not detached. It carried the weight of memory. She described financial records, internal instructions, and specific conversations regarding asset protection strategies that predated the official divorce filing. She referenced dates, account structures, and internal approvals with a level of detail that made denial increasingly difficult. As she spoke, Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, But Helen noticed his breathing had changed. It was slower now, measured, controlled in a way that suggested effort rather than ease. Margaret continued, her tone unchanged. She confirmed that certain accounts had been redirected gradually over time, and that documentation had been modified in stages, rather than all at once. When Daniel asked her directly whether Helen Brooks had been aware of these actions during the period in question, Margaret shook her head once. No, she said quietly. Mrs. Brooks was never included in those decisions. A faint murmur moved through the courtroom. The judge raised a hand for silence. Helen remained still, but something inside her settled into clarity rather than surprise. She had not been included, not because she lacked value, but because inclusion would have complicated control. Margaret then paused briefly before adding something that changed the tone of the room again. There is one more matter, she said. Daniel nodded for her to continue. Mr. Brooks often stated that emotional perception could interfere with financial decision-making within a marriage structure. He referred to Mrs. Brooks as stable but not strategically relevant to business operations. The phrase hung in the air longer than anything else said that morning. Not emotionally dramatic. Not exaggerated. Just precise enough to land with weight. Richard finally spoke from his seat. That is not what I meant, he said sharply, though his voice lacked its earlier force. You are taking it out of context. Margaret turned slightly toward him for the first time. Her expression did not show anger. Only clarity. Context does not change repetition, she replied. The courtroom remained silent again. Daniel returned to his seat slowly, and for a moment no one spoke. Helen felt no surge of triumph. Instead, she felt a quiet release, as if something that had been locked inside her for years had finally been acknowledged by more than just memory. The judge announced a brief pause to review the testimony and documents submitted. As people began to shift in their seats, Richard remained still, staring at the table in front of him. Vanessa gathered her papers with deliberate efficiency, avoiding any contact with him entirely. When Helen stood to leave her seat, she did not look at Richard. She did not need to. The version of him that had defined her life was no longer stable enough to define anything at all. As she walked out of the courtroom with Daniel beside her, the hallway felt different than it had earlier that morning. Lighter. Not because the situation had ended, but because the truth no longer needed to be carried in silence.